Okay, hello everybody. This is the ACT Day um, session talking about Chapter 25. Chapter 25 will be the part of the chapter that B-Day students will have to teach on their own, either through the PowerPoint, through the textbook, or through hopefully a video like this. And hopefully this is helpful for students who are here in the Zoom meeting itself or watching it later on YouTube. So again, if you have any questions about Chapter 25, always feel free to email me. So this chapter is all about the changes right after World War II, specifically on Americans on the home front. And really, it's basically all the changes that are happening that has nothing to do with the Cold War. Okay, chapter 24 is all about the Cold War and how it affects people on the home front back at home, like Wisconsin or New York or Texas. But chapter 25 is about how life is changing um, despite the Cold War or amidst the Cold War. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So um, hopefully the slides are big enough with my screen split up. So our central question, you can pause if you're watching this video later. Why did consumer culture become such a fixture in American life in the post-war decades? And how did it affect politics and society? So we're going to talk about what consumer culture is today, what that means for Americans, and how it's maybe different than the life of Americans before it. So the big thing we need to write down here, and I'm going to go ahead and write it up here as well, is the military industrial complex. So before World War II, our military is not that powerful. We do not have a lot of money being spent on our military especially compared to what it is now. But with World War II, the United States government assigns a lot of industries to create their war supplies. We saw that through the War Production Board. And through that, they gave a lot of these wartime contracts to big companies. And those big companies got bigger because of it. And they realized that, hey, if the government is just going to pay us all of this money for these war supplies, that our company can make a lot of money off that. And so in the 1950s, there is a growing private businesses or private factories making those supplies for the US government. Okay, I'm just gonna adjust this a little bit. Here we go. Perfect. Okay. And we haven't really talked about President Eisenhower yet in our in chapter 24, but we will talk about him. You might remember me mentioning President Eisenhower during World War II. He was one of the major generals of the Allied forces during the war. After the war, he becomes president, and as he's leaving his presidency, he warns the people against the growing military-industrial complex. He's arguing that if we allow it to become too big, it could become too powerful, to the point where we are spending too much money on it, that it's getting too big. But the U.S. government is going to really double down on its spending contracts after Eisenhower leaves office. It's going to be in the height of the Cold War. And so people aren't really concerned about how much money we're spending on their military, or could it be used somewhere else. they're concerned with their safety during the Cold War and not getting blown up by nuclear bombs. Okay. So factories all around the country after World War II will continue to build war supplies. Usually that has not happened. Usually when there's a war like World War I or Civil War, there's this growth of factories in preparation for the war. And then afterwards, they either shut down those factories or they use them for peacetime supplies. After World War II, they just keep making those war supplies. And so while there is a lot of different conflicts between us and Russia during this time, one, I guess, conflict that you could discuss is the space race. And while it's not really a international Cold War conflict where there's actually the potential of people dying, this is more of a intellectual race between the US and Russia in space. It's seeing who can have the best, who can have the highest flying missiles and the satellites that can go into space. And the space race really launches because of Russia's very first artificial orbiting satellite, which is Sputnik. And actually, you could see it from the ground with the naked eye. You'd go outside where it's dark, kind of away from a big city. You could see it'd be this little stream of light. You could tell it's not a star because it's moving pretty fast and it wasn't blinking, but you could see it. Now, really, the only thing it could do is send radio signals, but Americans were fearful that maybe Russia is passing the United States in technology and their science and reasoning. And so the US government wants to make sure that doesn't happen. So they're going to spend a lot of money to make sure that America's is spending money on its scientific and mathematic research. Excuse me. And so there's a new law called the National Defense Education Act. More money for science. I'm just gonna say STEM. STEM majors in universities. More science, more engineering, more math. Because the idea was that while American teenagers are watching television and listening to rock and roll, Russian teenagers are learning advanced calculus and quantum mechanics and all this stuff that's going to surpass the United States. And so there's this fear, and so a heavy input of money into these programs all around the country in colleges. So while that happened, Sputnik happened in 1957, just a few years later, Russia sends the first person into space. Later that year, the United States would also send someone into space, Alan Shepard, there he is. John Glenn would also be the first American to orbit the Earth. Okay, so each of these races, at least early on, Russia is winning a lot of these races. Russia is the first satellite in space, first dog in space, first man, first orbit. And so not just military factories or military industries, but lots of industries are turning towards more white-collared workers. White-collared workers are simply office jobs. many people who had been working in manufacturing and trading jobs in the past are now working in the corporate world, working in offices, working in cubicles. Corporations are relying on automation and mechanization much more than ever before. Machines are able to create the same products efficiently and cheaply. You don't have to pay a machine a wage. You don't have to pay a machine healthcare benefits. And when you take into account the price it costs to maintain the robot or machine or something like that, it's cheaper in the long run. And so many of these factories are beginning to turn to mechanization, which is going to have a major impact on manufacturing in the United States. A lot of manufacturing will either turn to automation, or it'll turn to what we'll see later, cheaper labor sources around the world. Okay. Remember, for those people who are in the Zoom meetings, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the Zoom chat. And so after World War II, the United States economy is going to boom. Say post-war economy. It's increasing, income rises, low inflation, increased GDP. GDP is an economics term used to describe a country's products that it creates. So if you add up all of the products a factory makes, all of the services companies provide, if you add them all up in the whole country, that's the GDP. And so when that number goes up, that means our businesses are doing well. That means our economy is doing well. And after World War II, our economy is booming. Now, while this was true, we do still see working class Americans being left behind. There's a book called The Other America about I'm gonna say working class Americans were poorly paid. And so because their wages remained the same and did not see that same income increase that we saw with like middle class or upper class Americans, working class Americans are getting left behind. We'll talk a little bit about how education begins to become more accessible to many Americans, but not to working class Americans, and how even housing can have a devastating effect on many Americans. So here's that line I was telling you about, the GDP. This shows our businesses and economies growth from 1947-ish to 1963. So this is the time frame of this chapter 25. And you can see our economy is doing really well in just 15-ish years. And so think about it. If you were let's say a middle-aged person living in the 1950s, you've been through a lot in your life. You know, you might have been a young person in the 1920s when people were buying a whole bunch of stuff through credit and everything seemed to be great. But then there was the Great Depression and people lost everything. People lost their savings, they lost their stock market increase, they had bank runs, so they lost everything. And then right after that, when you think the Great Depression might be fixed, there's World War II where there's rationing and you can't just go out and buy what you want. Then after World War II, the economy is doing well for most Americans and there's no restrictions to what you can buy. for most Americans, the last 15 or so years, they haven't been able to buy whatever they wanted. Either they didn't have the money or they weren't allowed to because of the war. And now you have all this extra money and there's no limits. And so people are going to go crazy buying whatever they want. And so this is going to lead to the consumer lifestyle of the 1950s. One way life after World War II is going to change for many Americans is for the veterans who return. And that's because of a law called the GI Bill. GI refers to the veterans. And the GI Bill is basically going to be this big promise to American soldiers when they return that the US government's going to spend a lot of money, for veterans to go to college, to get a new home, to get all these different services that the government had never really provided before. For returning veterans to go to college and buy a home. So like veterans, when they wanted to buy a home, usually you have to put a down payment for a home. Sometimes that could be 10 or 20% of the value of the home. With the GI Bill, returning veterans only had to put $1 down in a deposit. That's that's crazy. You can't find that anywhere today. It made college either low, very, very low, or no cost for returning veterans. And so these are going to be huge legs up for these veterans who are returning, because you buy a home and you don't have to pay that down payment, so you're able to spread out the payments throughout the life of the mortgage, which means you have more cash right now that you can buy stuff that you want. You can buy a bigger home, and then later on when you're going to sell it, you're making more money. This is really going to help veterans. We're going to skip labor unions here. And we're going to skip this slide. We don't need to write anything down here. But with all this extra money now that veterans and middle-class Americans are going to get, companies realize that they need to start selling not just to the adults of the family, but to the children of the 1950s. Because there are a lot of children being born during this time. And they realize, hey, if we sell our product for a child specifically, families are going to buy it. And so companies are developing disposable diapers for the very first time, instant formula for mothers. Toddlers and children are now getting television programs designed for them, board games designed for them, toys for them, rock and roll music for teenagers. Things are changing quickly. And the biggest impetus to change during the 1950s is arguably the television. At the beginning of the 1950s, somewhere around 5% of American homes had a TV in it. By the end of the decade, almost 90% of homes had a television. And so television was a way to create regular programming for an entire country. I don't even know what to say for television. Americans were addicted to it. They watched hours and hours of TV. They watched programs. Many of them were focused on suburban lives. Remember, suburban lives are small towns outside of big cities. In many cases, these shows were about white families where the husband goes off and works during the day. There is a stay-at-home wife, and the kids go to school, and it shows their life throughout their day. And people loved it. People watched it all the time for hours and hours. We're not going to watch it right now in class or right now in this video, but if you can, go check out some of the commercials that are on this slide. These are from the 1950s and early 60s, where you can see some of the changes in commercials from today to 70 years ago. And so with television becoming more and more popular, uh, they also realize they can make a lot of money by targeting television and music and movies to teenagers. Um, Companies had never really targeted teenagers before as a demographic, um, and they're realizing that, um, especially for companies selling a product, if you can sell a product to a teenager, you potentially could have that person as a customer for the rest of their lives. Look at what Apple does with their cell phones. Apple is very careful at curating this image that teenagers have to have an iPhone. And the idea that Apple is going with is if we can get a teenager to have an iPhone in their hands, they're probably going to buy an iPhone for the rest of their lives. And so companies are going to use youth culture as a way to sell products. Hollywood makes movies for teenagers, and rock and roll becomes the music of teenagers in the 1950s. Because music or rock and roll during this time initially came from African American rhythm and blues music from the 1940s. Elvis Presley was a singer who was probably the most famous example of this. He used a lot of the same musical attributes as African American singers before him. However, at this time in the 1940s and early 50s, many radio programs would not play African American artists on their waves. And so when Elvis comes along, he's playing this new type of music, and he's also white, which basically is this perfect storm of becoming the first nationally recognized rock and roll star. Um, the adults during this time are very wary of rock and roll. They see it as a sign of rebellion, of premarital sex. They're very worried about this. Um, and yeah, music never is the same again. One thing that young people are also going to do is criticize the actions of their parents in a movement called the Beats. So young people who are born, during the war, right after the war, they're, 15, 20, 25 years old during this time. They're going to criticize the suburban lifestyle, the consumer lifestyle, the idea that you have to buy stuff to make you happy, that you have to live in a certain type of home to make you happy. And they would do a lot of like poetry um, about this changing lifestyle of Americans, and the parents didn't understand. The parents I should say, I don't think either generation understood each other. I don't think the young people understood that the adults are just happy they can buy stuff. After the Great Depression and World War II, they're just happy they can buy a grill or go out and um, go bowling or something. Whereas the young people, they're more used to this. That's what they've known, and so it's easy to criticize. And the parents didn't like understand this. So there's a growing disconnect between the young people during this time and their parents. Um, in the 1950s, there's going to be a larger religious revival um, where many people would turn to Christianity after World War II. Church membership is going to increase from about 50% in 1940 to about 70% in 1960. Um, and so American Christians are going to heavily use the Cold War as a way to differentiate themselves from Russia. Um, Russia's government was a well-known atheistic government, and so to basically kind of show the division between the United States and Russia, America doubled down on Christianity, including inserting for the very first time the phrase "under God" into the Pledge of Allegiance. The man in the picture here is Billy Graham. He is a preacher. He would go on what he called crusades, where he'd basically give these lectures to people all around the country, and thousands of people would show up. And he talked about the gospel and the way that Jesus would enable people to have a second birth, a rebirth. And as you can see, it was a very successful movement. And we've already talked about like the first and second great awakenings back in the 1730s, the 1830s. Some would call this to be the third great awakening. We have a large increase of church membership in the 1950s, and I don't think I'd argue against that. And so the war is over. Um, the veterans come home. Let's see, sorry, see chat. Yeah, ENS is like a proto televangelist. Yeah, yep. They're just like that, only no television. They go around just like the preachers in the first and second great awakening, and they preach to the masses. And yep, so that's exactly what happens. So we have all these veterans coming home after the war. They're finding their girlfriends and their sweethearts that they've missed for a long time, and they're ready to celebrate. And with that celebration comes a lot of babies. And so this is called the baby boom. Lots of babies being born after World War II. We have all these veterans coming back. They're all finding their girlfriends, they're getting married, and they're having a whole bunch of babies. More babies are born after World War II than in the previous 30 years. Average age of marriage decreases again down to about 20 years old for women, 22 for men. And you can see this picture that's on here. It almost looks like there's like a mirror. So it looks like there's more babies in there, but that's not a mirror. That's actually just going like all these little bassinets of babies going on and on and on. They would have these suburbs where a lot of these young families would live, and they would have midwives and doctors specifically for delivering babies, And they just do this day in and day out because so many babies were being born during this time. And so people looked for ways to raise their children. And one of the ways was a book from Dr. Spock. And he just wrote a book on how to raise babies. And they talk, and this is really the first time where we have baby books like this being born, that's being sold to a national audience. It sold millions of copies, and it talked about things like if the mom is too protective and too, if they spoil the baby too much, that could hurt the children when they're an adult. And so there's all this research that's done and creating um, this idea of this is how you should raise your child, which I can tell you right now is something that like young families and how to raise a kids, it's all over today. Like, oh, you should raise your kids like this or this, and you can find 10 different ways of doctors or people who say they're certified saying this is how you should raise your kid. Um, and we we really see the beginning of that here in the 1950s. Um, Now, with so many babies being born, this is on one hand going to um, make working outside the home, in some cases, difficult for women. We talked about in the 1940s that during World War II, many women who had been traditionally denied access to certain high skilled, high paying jobs um, suddenly have these jobs available to them because of so many men fighting in the war. Um, After the war, many women um, leave um, the workforce. Many middle class women leave the workforce. There's this idealized, um, I guess, image of women that's portrayed in advertisements and TV shows of women as a homemaker who takes care of the kids and takes care of this house. And so that's kind of this image or societal pressure that's being put on women in the 1950s. Um, However, working class women, um, women who are working in low skilled or low paying jobs, usually are staying in the workforce. But even women who are working in jobs, even middle class women who continue to work outside the home, are often working in positions that are dominated by men. Women still suffer from sexual harassment in these fields. They're often paid less in the gender wage gap. And um, so there's this social expectations for women to be um, housewives, take care of the kids, take care of the family. However, despite that, there is going to be a slow increase of women working in the workplace. So that does continue to increase, even with many women leaving the workplace as men come back. It would be offset by especially working class women going off to work for the first time. Okay. And this video is, or this slide is kind of just what I said before. TV shows depict women at home, happy homemakers, and like the last bullet point, even when women did work outside the home, when they returned home in the evening, they still bore the responsibility to take care of the kids and take care of the house. Okay, so that's seen as um, the sometimes called the double shift of, if you have to work at outside the home, then you got to come home and you got to work there too. And so um, while there's this kind of societal pressure to work in one way, um, there are these kind of undercurrents of questioning the social norm. And one way that is done is through the birth control pill. It became accessible to women for the first time. However, it was restricted. It oftentimes would not be prescribed to unmarried women, only to married women, and sometimes only with the permission by their husbands. We don't need to write about Kinsey because we're going to talk about something else. But basically, Kinsey is going to talk about human sexuality and about how um, uh, sexuality is not the binary um, uh, system that Americans thought it was in the 1950s. There's actually a wide range of sexual experiences and lifestyles that um, had been kind of hidden during this time period when it was often seen as a social taboo. So we're going to write around the Mattachine Society. One thing that Dr. Kinsey claimed was that homosexuality was more prevalent than Americans believed. He said about 10% of men were exclusively homosexual. And so in the 1950s, there is the beginnings of what we see of an LGBTQ movement. In the 1950s, the activists are called homophiles. These are gay and lesbian activists in the 1950s. And one of the some of the organizations are the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, and they're going to be activists for LGBTQ rights. They did not use the phrase LGBTQ. That is contemporary language for us. But one of the ways that they're going to kind of fight for more rights in the 1950s is kind of a little different than the um, method they will use in the 1960s or people will use. In the 1950s, activists will try to portray themselves as following along with the suburban middle class image. And what we'll see later in the 1960s is basically that I don't have to live my life in this suburban puzzle piece. I can live more independent in the way I want to, and it doesn't matter what um, my sexual history or life is like. That doesn't matter. I should have equal rights regardless. But in the 1950s, they tried to portray themselves as the suburban middle class image. Just checking to see how many slides we have left. Not too many left. I think we'll be done in about 10-15 minutes here. Now, with all these people coming back from the war, needing a place to live, the number one place that they're going to look to live is in suburbs. I wouldn't even say small, I'd say. So we see a lot of people moving to these large cities in these suburbs, and one of the benefits of these suburbs, or one of the ways that they built them, basically they're going to create an assembly line process, but for building a house. And so what they'll do is they'll have each person that has the job in a house, like maybe they're in charge of the crane that digs the hole for the basement, and maybe there's one crew for laying out the concrete and one crew for putting up the studs. And so they're just going to go from plot to plot and fill out the house instead of building like one house at a time. They're going to be building hundreds at a time. And the most famous example of this is a place called Levittown. There's a man named William Levitt who's going to use these assembly line techniques, these mass production techniques.
Oh, the racist suburb dude.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in just a second. And so this is the way that they're going to build homes very quickly. It's very successful right outside of New York. They're also going to do it in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other suburbs will use the same technique throughout the 1950s. They buy up a whole bunch of farmlands outside of cities, and they develop it around the country. I mentioned before that the government is going to make it much easier to have veterans buy houses. Even if you weren't a veteran, you could get a low interest rate mortgage with your home. The problem was segregation issues in these suburbs and Levittowns. Many suburban neighborhoods, including Levittowns, were closed to non-whites. They would have restrictions in their neighborhood clauses and in their in your buying agreements that the house could not be bought or sold by a person of color. I mentioned before the FHA provided these mortgages with low interest rates. Oftentimes the FHA would not provide mortgages to African American buyers if they were trying to live in certain neighborhoods, especially if they were trying to live in an integrated neighborhood. They would not insure those mortgages. Eventually, the restrictions done by Levitt saying a suburb is closed to a certain group of people was outlawed, but the government would still refuse mortgages to African Americans and others, which is going to have major impacts on purchasing power, generational wealth for African Americans around the country. Here you can see a picture of home after home after home, very cookie cuttery like. And if you're going to live in a suburb, for most of America, you need a car. The transportation, once you get away from like New York City through trains, is not very great. And so if you live in a suburb, you're gonna have to buy a car. And luckily, gas is really cheap, about 15 cents a gallon. No one really cares about fuel efficiency, so cars are gigantic, and they waste gas, and no one really cares because gas is so cheap. And people are going to buy more and more cars. You can see in 15 years, the number of cars triples on American roads. And with all these cars, they need to build new roads for those cars. And so new laws passed, it's really long, the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. Money for an interstate highway system. And if you've ever seen the movie Cars, Cars is pretty historically accurate, right? In the picture there, you have Radiator Springs, and there's like the flashback in the middle of the movie where they show like what life was like before the highway was brought, and all these people came to Radiator Springs and they bought all this stuff, and everyone's so happy. But then the highway was built, right? And the highway is looking for the fastest way to get from major city to major city, and they don't go to the little towns anymore. They pass by them. And so when that happens, the small towns are going to lose that traffic. Not as many people are going to come, and so that means that those small towns, in many cases, are going to die if they don't have an industry, if they don't have a companies nearby to hire them. Um, they're not going to get very many tourists going by their small towns anymore. So unfortunately, for many small towns that used to be by smaller highways, they would die because of the growth of the highways. But highways are really helpful for workers commuting from suburbs to big cities. It's good for um, getting people around the country when they like traveling, going on vacations. And if there was an emergency like a war or we got invaded, the highways can be used to for evacuations and for like our military to use to move our equipment and soldiers. Okay, so this is the early routes. Um, we also have the growth of fast food restaurants. Inexpensive, quickly served meals, right? Perfected by McDonald's early on, where you can buy a hamburger for 15 cents. Perfect for the suburban family on the go. We see the beginnings of shopping malls, where suburbs are now building the markets closer to the suburbs, closer to the homes where people live. And the shopping mall would continue to increase in popularity for the next 30 or 40 years. We're going to skip the Sun Belt. Many people are moving to these southern states, Florida, Texas, California. A lot of the factories are continuing on to be built. We talked about that happens in World War II. After the war, when some factories need to get shut down, are they going to shut down their brand new factory they just opened in California, or the old rusty one that's in Cleveland? They're going to shut down the ones in New England and the Midwest. And so that causes people to move to southern states. We talked a little bit about that growth. We need to write about the Kerner Commission. And it talked about how America is becoming more separated based on race. That segregationist policies are separating Americans, whether it's through housing policies, voting restrictions, the factories that that went to southern states, to southwestern states. And so for many people who lived in these big cities, in northern cities now, places like Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, all of a sudden all these factories just up and leave. And so many people began living in apartment buildings that were used during the war, but now there's no factory nearby. Unfortunately, many people who were living in these apartments suffered from unemployment. Many people who are in these situations are suffering from job discrimination. African American workers were often the first ones to be fired. And so they faced housing restrictions that we talked about before, segregation in schools. And many of these cities are changing. They're trying to rebuild city centers where they build new modern construction. In some cases, they'll build a new highway to a big city. And instead of going through a middle-class neighborhood where people might have more money to fight back, they'll intentionally build a highway through these apartment buildings where people don't have as much money to maybe fight back using lawyers or as much power in the system to question why the government's choosing to do what they do. And so this is going to increase racial segregation even more. And there's one more thing we need to write down. Because of this, we also see something called white flight. Where many Americans, white Americans will move to suburbs in these new places like Levittown, further away from the big city. And at the same time, when the suburbs in Levittown are denying access to African Americans. And while I wouldn't go to say people are fleeing and trying to like hide from the changes in the big cities, it's a denial of people of color from moving into these neighborhoods. And that's called white flight. That's what sociologists refer to as this phenomenon. Okay. And that is it, everybody. I told you I could get done by 3:30. Are there any questions before I finish up, everyone? Okay. Oh, is there a question? Okay. Well, if you have any questions, please let me know. Make sure you check out your study guide. I could have forgotten something in here, so make sure you check that out. You're still responsible for all the information in chapter 25. So if you have any questions, please let me know. But that's it for this video, everyone. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Bye now.
Thanks, Mr. Barth.